to PCU. Today I'd like to share with you some classic games, experiences from over 100 years ago that were played by the great players of that era. We'll examine various critical positions in how to make the decisions to achieve the best you can from the given situation. Let's get started with this position where it is white's turn. Before we go any further, let's do a basic evaluation of what's going on. Well, let's start with the material balance as always. We can see each side has a queen, each side has two rooks, and each side has a minor piece which is valued the same 3 points, a knight versus a bishop. Then, lastly, we come to the pawns, and we'll see that white has only 5 pawns, while black has 6. So, as on the material count, black is doing better, black is a pawn up. Moreover, black is threatening immediately to capture another pawn by rook captures on d4. So the question is, what should white do right now? Well, in addition to evaluating the material count, it's also important to see what else is going on in the position. On that end, we can see that the white queen is occupying a real attractive position on h6, right near the black king, because black has already weakened some dark squares around his king's castle position. Now this invites a couple of ideas to attack. When the opponent's king's position has been weakened, that's certainly an invitation to launch an attack and try to checkmate. I suggest you give it a little bit of a thought and try to figure out what plans you may have to aid the queen in the attack, because it is rarely enough to have a lone king to lead to a successful attack. You need one of your other pieces. After a couple of minutes of thought, come back, and here is the response what white can consider as an attacking plan. You can freely use your imagination in trying to see where you would like to see your pieces, and then, of course, have a reality check and see what of those plans have any realistic hopes to succeed. Well, in this situation, white can use either the knight to help the queen or one of the rooks. And hopefully you came to the ideas that I'm about to show. One option would be if the knight from e5 could be replaced to f6. Right? Imagine that white knight right now being on f6, which would check the black king, and then if that king would move out of that check to the corner, the white queen would be ready to capture the pawn on h7 and checkmate. Well, you may say that's a nice dream, but obviously the knight does not move as a bishop, and therefore it cannot move to f6 right now. Well, that is certainly true. However, the knight may try to move to g4, only one move away from the f6 square, and now indeed threatening not only to check the black king, but also to give a fork immediately to the black queen and king. So that's a very serious threat, because after that white would threaten to checkmate on h7 as well as to win the black queen. So white definitely has a devastating threat, and black must do something about it. Now, if the king moves out, white would be ready to jump in here anyway, even though it's not a check right now. It still has those very same threats, that is, to checkmate with the queen, as well as to capture black's queen on e8. So this certainly would not be a good idea after white plays knight g4. So this is one idea. Let's go back and see other options, and then we come back on how black may or may not defend. What else can we consider here for white? Well, another way to try to aid the queen would be, with the knight, to move the knight back to f3. That's a bit slower, because right now there is no immediate threat. The threat is to come to g5 and then only to create a threat of checkmating with the queen. So this is a 3-move plan in contrast to the previous one, which was knight g4, which was a 2-move plan where the threat was very immediate. The knight was arriving on f6 with a check, with a devastating check, and winning the game. So this is the second option. And finally, the third option would be to move the rook up to g4 and then with the idea to aid the queen from h4, threatening to capture the pawn on h7. And then again, this is a 3-move plan. The rook g4 doesn't threaten with anything immediate, but threatens to move to h4, and that would already threaten with the checkmate. So now let's go back and compare these 3 options. The first one, knight g4, which may look at best at the first look, unfortunately gives black the opportunity to defend. Black right now could either move his queen up to e7, for example, to protect that key f6 square, or may right away push the pawn up to f6. Because right now, even though the white knight can capture on f6, it would not be a good idea, because the black rook immediately would capture it and white would give up a knight for a pawn, which obviously is not a good deal. So this doesn't achieve anything immediate. Let's go back again to the starting position and look at what would happen after knight returning to f3. Well, as we said, the threat right now is to play knight g5, but just like after knight g4, black could now successfully play f6, preventing white's knight again moving to g5. So finally, we're coming to the correct solution. While it is a slower one than the knight g4 move, it at least achieves it slowly but surely, as they say. So white played in a game rook g4, and by the way, this is a game between one of the best players of his era, Adolf Andersen, from 1878. This game was played in 1878 in Paris, France, and his opponent was Clark. Right now, the white rook is aiming to go to h4 and to checkmate. So while the quick immediate attempt with knight g4 didn't quite work out because black could defend, now even though this is slower, black has no real good way to defend against the threat. Let's see what would happen if black immediately would play f5 right away, attacking white's rook, with the idea that after the rook moves to h4 with the threat to checkmate on h7, and now queen e7 would transpose to the game, which we'll see in a minute, and of course rook f7 to start with gives up a rook for the knight, which already is a good deal for white, although it may be even stronger to capture on g6 to destroy the defense in front of the black king. Now, if pawn captures knight, white checkmates immediately, so that's certainly not an option for black. And otherwise, for example, after rook g7, white would be ready to reposition the knight to f4, threatening with moves like knight takes pawn on e6, as well, just as importantly, knight h5, which would then in turn attack the rook, as well as threaten to come to that key f6 square. So white certainly has a pleasant choice of which way to go in this position, whether to capture the rook, which is the simple and safe way to go, or to go for the kill immediately after capturing knight takes g6. So let's go back and see the game, which continued after white played rook to g4. Black responded immediately with queen to e7, with the idea that after rook h, now black plays f5. So now the queen from e7 protects on h7. But white is ready for action and to destroy black's king's position, and came knight g6. Now, quite importantly, black cannot safely capture back because white would immediately follow up with a check and then winning black's queen with this skewer. And then after king e8, importantly, the rook captures the queen with a check, and then the white queen is free to run away, maintaining a significant material advantage. Going back to the game after knight g6, black responded with queen g7, and white just captured, king captured back, and white is collecting the material. And here we can see that white is up an exchange and a pawn, meaning that white has an extra rook versus a bishop, plus white has an extra pawn as well, which is a total of a 3-point advantage. The game lasted a little bit longer, but black, of course, couldn't turn things around and white won. Let's move on and see another game by the same Anderson from the same year, 1878, against a different opponent. Here we go. Let's look at this position and see what's going on here. Right now, we have on the piece count a material balance. However, on the pawn count, just like in the previous position, white now is up a pawn. Now, what else do we need to clearly notice about the position? There is something that should immediately come to mind, and that is that the white king's position has been significantly weakened by the white pawn advancing to g4 at an earlier stage of the game. So that's certainly a red flag both for white and for black. For white, meaning that generally you would hope to exchange queens, and you want to make sure you get defensive pieces around your king if that pawn is already not there. On the black side, of course, it's an invitation to an attack against the white king. Now this position is somewhat of an exception because white in the game has tried to exchange the queens as soon as possible and it did not work. On the other hand, the correct way to continue would have been to play knight to d2 to support control of the e4 square. And we shall see why the other move didn't work. So in this position, after white played queen e4, black doesn't have a choice. The black queen cannot escape the exchange. So the question is, why is that wrong? When you're up a material, you want to trade pieces, especially queens, and especially in a situation where your king's position has been weakened on the king's side. Now here there is another element which white didn't pay enough attention to. Black responded by playing rook a to e8, not only accepting the fact that the queens will be traded, but in fact inviting, forcing, pushing white to trade the queens on d5. Sadly for white, after the exchange of the queens, there is a big unsolvable problem, and that is the positioning of the knight on g5. And that's another reason in this game which shows that the pawn move to g4 was certainly a weakening not only of the king's position but also of the potential retreat of the white knight to f3. So now all of a sudden you can see that the white knight has no acceptable square to go to. In the meantime, black is threatening to attack the knight by playing h6. The problem is that after, for example, white would play king g2 to bring support to the f3 square and then to respond h6 with knight retreating to f3, black would first give an intermediate check, and then when the white king moves out of the check, regardless where, then again renew this threat of playing h6, and the white knight has no real retreat. Okay, let's go back again. We saw queen e4, mistake, rook e8, the queens got exchanged, and in this position, white continued by playing knight to d2. The idea of the move is, again, to control the f3 square another time. So after black would play h6 right now, the knight could safely retreat to f3. Now, from black's perspective, we understand that's what white wants to do. But we should see if is there a good way to take under control the f3 square a second time. So then, after again the h6 trapping the knight threat would get renewed. And indeed there is an excellent move, moving the knight to h4. So now, in addition to the rook, the black knight also is targeting that same square, and again the deadly threat has been renewed to play h6. And here white responded by playing f4. Now again, if h6, the knight is safe to retreat. So what should black do? Well, the obvious move would be to capture the pawn that just moved on f4, to capture it with the bishop. However, even though black would win the pawn back by doing that, it would release the white knight from its captivity, and a bunch of exchanges would take place. For example, after bishop takes, rook takes, and rook takes, and bishop takes, and now white actually takes over the initiative by playing rook c8, attacking black's bishop, and it is black who gets into serious trouble, as a matter of fact, because the bishop cannot move, it's pinned. If the king moves to protect the bishop, white will fork with knight e6, losing the rook on f4, and if the rook retreats to f8, white could respond by playing knight to e6, attacking the rook. Okay, let's go back to the game and see what should black do. We saw what black shouldn't do. Now let's see what should black do. Well, this is another critical moment in the game where it's important to make the right decision. I suggest you take a couple of minutes and try to figure out what's a better choice than capturing the pawn on f4. Well, black has to play really energetically and use the possibility that all of these white pieces are on dark squares, and it allows for black for a nice little combination. Rook captured on e3, white captured back, and black played bishop f4. By the way, black was Rosenthal, playing against one of the top players of the world at the time, Anderson. So after the bishop captured on f4, white has skewered all his pieces. In fact, if you look, the knight is hanging on g5 obviously, and the rook on e3, but if the rook moves away, some additional pieces will be hanging. So the rook, the most valuable of the attacked pieces, moved away to e7, counter-attacking black's bishop. And now black captured first one knight, and then the second knight, and now the rook is hanging. White continued by moving the rook to c7, which makes things even easier for black. White is now threatening to checkmate along the 7th rank, but black doesn't need to waste time on defense. Black can win further material right now by making the right choice, which is playing bishop to e3 check. Now the problem is, if the king moves to the corner, Black will checkmate in 2 moves with rook f1, king h2, followed by bishop to f4. What a pretty checkmate. Optimally used all the pieces. Or, if the white king moves to h2 right away, then the problem is that black is ready to fork by playing bishop f4, and the rook on c7 will be lost. What a beautifully played game by Rosenthal. Let's move on to our next example. That was played by the Russian chess genius of the 19th century, Chigorin, against Yakubovich. This is a very fascinating position where white played a very interesting and nice attacking game, sacrificed a bunch, and at the moment white is down a rook, having only a pawn as compensation. However, we can also notice the devastating pin along the a1 h8 diagonal. We see on one hand that white is able to capture the rook on g7 with the bishop immediately. However, that would unpin the black rook, obviously, and transpose to a situation where black has less material advantage. However, white's initiative and attack would be diminished at the same time. Quite amazingly, white has a winning plan here. Pretty beautiful. And I would call this actually as the jewel of the week. If white is not careful, black has a counter threat, and that is to move the queen to the corner, and then white would be pretty much getting checkmated after blocking that check with a couple of pieces which the black queen will capture. Luckily for white, it is his turn, and with a quiet and simple f3 move, white can prevent that. Now the problem for black is that the black pieces are kind of pegged up nicely like a suitcase. The queen on f8 cannot move away unless it would be a check without allowing white to capture the rook on g7 with the bishop and then checkmate on the following move. Also, there's nothing black can do for now in exchanging the bishops, because after bishop f6, white would just capture that. So the only plan black could have is to advance the b and c pawns and try to interpose on the diagonal between the white bishop and the black rook on g7. However, it comes a bit too slow. Came f5, b4, and now the beautiful plan, rook g3. c4. So black is almost there, almost ready to play c3 and disconnect the bishop. However, white came just too quick. White can force checkmate within 3 moves right now. Moving the rook to h3 would not be the right answer, because the black queen could now already capture the pawn on f5 and protect on h7 at the same time, while now white has only 2-fold attack on the rook because the rook from g3 has left. So going back to this position, the correct answer is queen h7. Beautiful queen sacrifice, and after king captures, check, and black can only delay the checkmate by 1 more move, bishop h4, rook takes, and checkmate. What a brilliantly played end. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned some interesting ideas from these critical moments. So long, until next time.